for the first time ever on this show, one of the voices of Husker baseball as the Huskers get ready for an important week ahead, and that's Nick Handley of Huskers Radio Network. Nick, appreciate the time, my friend. How are we feeling going into the final week of the regular season?
Well, good to be on with you, Nick. I would say pretty good. I think obviously you look at the last 3 games, you're getting a opportunity to sweep, and really what was a close game on Sunday too. Had a chance to win that game on Sunday as well, possibly getting a sweep against Michigan. But you get 2 out of 3. That was the series that I think a lot of us circled and said this is going to give you an indication of where Nebraska is, how they're feeling going into that possible Big Ten tournament push. And I thought they surpassed a lot of expectations, both on the mound. And the interesting thing is, if you were to tell me that they would have beat Michigan 2 out of 3, I would have said, well, they're slugging the ball pretty well. Yeah. That was one of the more tame offensive games or series for Nebraska, yet defensively and on the mound, they got it done. You know the offense is there. So I think I asked this question to Will on Sunday. Every team wants to feel like they're playing their best baseball. You get to this part of the season, and he said there's no question they're playing their best baseball. And I think the results really at the end of April going into May, even really good chunk of the month of April going into May, I think those results would back that up.
Now, I'm thrilled that you brought up the pitching, because the staff chose to go with Tucker Timmerman on Friday, and I don't call it a demotion for Will Walsh. I just call it a new role. Because I think there is a much needed opportunity, and there's a necessity for Will Walsh in the bullpen or in some spots going into the Big Ten tournament if Nebraska makes it. But Tucker Timmerman comes out on Friday, and he has 7 innings, then has a really nice performance on Friday. And I was telling these guys earlier in the week, that just sets you up so much better for the weekend when you can get a quality start out of your Friday night guy. We saw it time and time again last year with Brett Sears.
Yeah, and look what happened this weekend. And despite the loss on Sunday, Nebraska's in great shape from the bullpen standpoint. And you set that tone on Friday. It doesn't matter what necessarily Ty Horn or even Jackson Brockett do on Saturday and Sunday, because your bullpen is dictated on what happens on Friday. And they were able to go in with a best-case scenario plan with Tucker Timmerman, but then they had the worst-case scenario backup plan as well. The fact that they got to go with plan A, which is Tuck go as long as you can. We'll have Christo be your setup guy, and then we'll go to Luke Broderick. And it worked out great for Nebraska. Then on Saturday, what you get out of Ty Horn. And you go back to the Will Walsh versus Tucker Timmerman conversation here. Look at what Will Walsh did on Saturday out of the bullpen. And this is where I think Will Walsh setting the tone when he's not on his game. And Will has been on his game many, many times. I want to make that perfectly clear. But sometimes he'll be out over the plate to a fault, and that stuff will be a little bit flat. And when an offense is in that attack mode and try to be aggressive to really set the tone early in a game, he can get hit around a little bit. And he was. And then in his last start, he was missing spots because I think he was trying to be too fine. He was trying to overly locate his pitches. And I think that led to him being out of the zone. And then all of a sudden you're pitching from behind 3-0, 3-1, and those guys are having the advantage in the batter's box. For Tucker, here's a guy that his stuff isn't devastating. But what he does have is he's got a very heavy fastball, and then he's got an ultra sink with his sinker. And so even when he's getting 2-0, maybe backwards and counts a little bit, or even some traffic on the base, he can still induce pretty weak contact. And he's a ground ball away from getting out of a lot of jams, as to where sometimes Will doesn't necessarily throw into weak contact all the time. So that's where I think the difference between Tucker Timmerman and Will Walsh, two of some of the better competitors on this team, I think Tuck still gives you that opportunity to get out of some big innings with that sinker.
Speaking of opportunities to get out of big innings, who are some of the high leverage guys that we're seeing Nebraska's staff turn to? Like, I think Luke Broderick, we saw it over the weekend, is one of those guys. Last year, a lot of times, even early in his career, it was Worthley who Jalen Worthley, who unfortunately is battling a little bit of an injury here. But I guess like going into the last week of the regular season and then what would be the Big Ten tournament, in a couple of weeks. Who are some of those high leverage guys that we can look at and say, okay, you know what? If Nebraska's in a jam, who's Rob Childress, Will Bolton, the rest of the guys going to turn to?
Well, I think it starts at 25. I think Drew Christo, even with the amount of work that he has put in this year and the innings that he's logged, I still think he's one of those guys that between the mentality and the stuff that he has on the mound physically, I think that's your best bet because remember, Drew Christo is a reliever in a starter's body, and his arm is still conditioned to where he can give you 50 to 60 pitches and probably still be very effective. You mentioned Jalen Worthley. It's too bad because I think he was definitely going to be right there next to Drew Christo. Drew would be your Friday guy. Worthley would be your Saturday guy. But the other guy that has really stepped up as of late is Casey Dice. And that was the role that he was supposed to be a year ago, I think. And now he's just been a lot more disciplined with his body this year. His stuff has been better. He's worked ahead of hitters. So I think Casey Dice is another one of those guys that they'll throw in any situation and feel like kind of similar to Timmerman where he can throw into some weak contact. And they like that about him. Now there's some new guys that are emerging right now, too. Obviously, Luke Broderick. And here's the other thing about Broderick. I know sometimes when people maybe wince a little bit when they see him come out for a second or even in some occasions a third inning, remember, this was a guy that was a starter a year ago at Iowa Western. So his arm is still conditioned to where if he has to go beyond 3 or 4 outs, he can still be pretty effective. But before you turn the ball over to him, to your original question, there are 2 guys that I think are emerging right now. Grant Clevenger to come in to get you maybe an out or 2. If you look at his numbers, they're good, but then you look at the innings, not a lot of innings logged, but he's gotten some pretty important outs here in the last month or so. But another guy that I think is also really starting to turn a corner as a freshman is Gavin Blachowicz. Blachowicz is another guy that he's got a powerful fastball, but he's starting to locate the complementary stuff as well. So I look at those guys. And then here's the other thing. Maybe right next to Drew Christo, your most important reliever out of the bullpen very well could be 30, could be Will Walsh, because you've got some lefties that are going to be effective. I think Caleb Clark also gives you a lot of upside there. I think there's other guys that even I'm missing one here. Price Bender as a freshman who has come in a lot of different areas. And he's another guy that if he's not flat, now sometimes he'll leave it flat a little bit. He with the creativity, with the different arm angles, the delay with his release, all those little things that he tries to keep hitters out on their front side, he can be effective. But I do think Gavin Blachowicz is one of those freshmen that is really starting to emerge. And then if in an emergency situation, he was sort of MIA for about 28, 29 days, but when he came in against Kansas State a couple weeks back, he was rock solid, and that's Colin Novacek. So there's a couple of freshmen right there. Bender's been used more. I think Novacek was used early, then he wasn't as much. Now, all of a sudden, you're starting to see Gavin Blachowicz really find himself, and I think feel more confident on the mound as well.
We're speaking with one of the voices of Husker baseball, Nick Handley, on the show on our Allo VIP line brought to you by Allo Fiber. Now, Nick, I guess let's turn to the offense here, because Nebraska's offense, you mentioned it wasn't the most notable over the weekend, but it didn't need to be because the pitching showed up on the mound. I think when you look at this lineup, it's been a lineup in a year where there's been a lot of changes. There's been a lot of shuffling. I can't remember the exact number of games. It was like 20 something until they had the same lineup as the day before, and people freaked out and really infatuated themselves with that. Just kind of overall thoughts on the lineup from 1 to 9 with guys like Riley Silva stepping up this weekend. But then also there were some unfortunate setbacks for maybe a guy like Robbie Bolin who started to catch some fire, but then had a tough weekend.
Yeah, and the other part about that is I keep using this moment of the season as a major benchmark, and we all remember it, and especially myself, who was with the team for all 11 days in LA. That was a tough series, tough road trip offensively. And I remember when we came back from that, Nebraska was hitting right around, I don't know the exact number, but it's just above 230. And that's not going to get done, especially with the experience that you have in that lineup. Other than the 2-game midweek set with Pepperdine, Nebraska could not drive the ball, with the exception of maybe Tyler Stone, who was pretty consistent over the rest of the week. Everyone else was really struggling. And so I think what Will Bolt has done, first of all, he's been extremely proactive with this offense. It's a collaborative effort between he, Mike Sirianni, and Lance Arvell, and I know Will has really stepped in there too. And I think they're combining a lot of efforts. And you saw the fruits of that labor really the first week back from that trip, where Nebraska went from hitting, again, just above 230 to now right around 275. And that's where they've been. And I can give you 2 examples of guys that have now really lengthened this lineup for Nebraska as to where we saw before it was Nebraska hitting maybe, 1 through 4 was a problem, but then after you got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you felt more confident on the mound that you could get those guys just based on their previous results. But now you're starting to look at where you had Robbie Bullen leading off. Now he's batting down on the lineup, but that's a guy that can find himself on base. You look at, what you mentioned, Riley Silva had a really solid weekend, and Coach Bolt talked about it. He really liked the way that he was attacking his at-bats, and so with that speed, being able to set the table, and he rewarded them getting on multiple times in that series against Michigan. But I look at Caden Brumbaugh, who's been one of the most consistent hitters throughout this season, really hasn't had a lengthy lull at all. And he's a quick adjustment type of guy throughout games. But the big improvement that you've seen that I think lengthens this lineup is Joshua Overbeek, who is just tearing the cover off the ball right now. He has been so good. And you're seeing Case Anderson now come around as well. And Case is still a little bothered with a back injury. And he and Tyler Stone, those are two guys that are probably not going to be 100% this entire year, but they're out there. Whether they're 75 or 80%, it's still pretty good, and they're getting solid contact. So now you're starting to look at a lineup that even if you bat Robbie Bullen in the 8 spot, and just before this weekend, we saw Joshua Overbeek hitting 8 or 9, you're getting guys that you still got to deal with that part of the lineup. And even Hogan Aligso showing a little thump off the bat this weekend too. You've got guys like Will Jeske that can provide you a clutch at bat here and there. Devin Nunez could do the same thing. Cale Frost can do the same thing. So there are options on that bench, but I think what they've done more than anything is they've lengthened that lineup, because you're seeing guys 1 through 9 that have all had their sustained moments here in this past month or so.
Go ahead, Nick. Aaron Davis here, man. Nick, just when you talk, man, I just want to get just some popcorn and just listen to you, because it just I'm like, I'm at the ballpark right now, baby. Nick, appreciate you coming on, man. You look at Purdue, they're going, a 30-21 team overall, but conference-wise, obviously they're struggling. Nebraska's hanging there at number 9. What would you like to see? What do you expect to see when Nebraska goes to West Lafayette this weekend? Actually, tomorrow, Thursday.
Yeah, we get that quick turnaround, and that's always interesting. This is the thing that I've noticed with Nebraska on these trips is you get finals in the rear view. All of a sudden, you've got a very loose, free-flowing team. Now, I know finals nowadays are a lot different than they were even 5 years ago, where you're actually present and there's a hard schedule that you had to adhere by. Now it's a little bit more on your own. But I still think once you got all your classwork behind you, it just makes for a much more loose business of baseball type of team. And I think typically Nebraska has responded pretty well. The thing about this team, and this is where they take their cues from the head coach, but this is also a veteran team. There's some bad blood between Purdue and Nebraska. We remember 2022 and we saw, right. And we saw a little bit of the John going back and forth, even a couple of years back when they got to face each other after that 2022. For people who don't realize, Purdue's inability to tarp the field. Essentially, if you look at what the odds were, Purdue was not going to beat the league champion Maryland on that last day. And if Purdue does indeed lose that game to Maryland, Nebraska goes to the Big Ten tournament. But to Nebraska's credit, Will Bolt said, hey, you know what? We didn't deserve to maybe be in the Big Ten tournament that year. I know other people still look at that situation of, come on, guys, that was kind of low class. So There's still a little bit of that hanging around. So I think more than anything, there's that motivation right there of, hey, we just want to beat these teams because we don't really like them. But the other part about it is there's a sense of urgency with Purdue, because Purdue is not mathematically eliminated. They could really jam some things up there at that 12th and final team to make it in Omaha. So they're going to be highly motivated. But this is what I like about what Nebraska's schedule has been this last month. It hasn't been the powers of the Big Ten. It's been the teams that are, like Nebraska, trying to get into the Big Ten tournament. So there's a major sense of urgency, and Nebraska, to their credit, has matched that. So I expect the same thing we've seen the last couple of weeks. I'd love to see them set the tone on Thursday and be able to work from ahead as opposed to try to come from behind, because that is it's worked for Nebraska, but you don't want to keep playing with fire a little bit there, because especially when you have a desperate Purdue team that's really trying to get themselves into the mix there. I think Thursday is a huge, huge game for both of these teams, because I think if you're Nebraska and you win on Thursday, I think you might have sucked the life out of Purdue, and then I think it's party time. But you got to get that first one. And Purdue, again, they've got some things that they can do. They can hit the ball pretty well. They took one out of Indiana, and they kind of put a little bit of scare into the Hoosiers in that series too. So this is a Purdue team that's more than capable. This isn't, I think, really the only team we can look at in the Big Ten and say, yeah, you're probably good, is Ohio State. Everybody else, they've just had weird years where they've had a moment you can point to, like, okay, they were playing really good baseball right there, and then for whatever reason, whether it's injuries or just baseball happening, they haven't been able to duplicate that success. Purdue's one of those teams like Michigan. They're battle tested. They play a lot of tough non-conference series, especially early in the year. So nothing that Nebraska is going to throw at them is going to be overwhelming to them. It's just, can Nebraska continue to execute? Can they bring the offense on top of the pitching that we saw this last week? And if they do that, I think they're going to be great this weekend.
Nick, couple more before we let you go. Two more specifically. One is kind of a bigger picture question, and it goes back involving a guy in Josh Overbeek that you mentioned a few moments ago, where with the new JUCO rule, it provides an interesting twist on things. A lot of fans, we always talk about this in the scope of football and maybe even basketball at times, but especially football. But for a program like Nebraska that is going to really need to try to take a step forward and not backwards next season, how important is it for some of these decisions for some of these guys like a Joshua Overbeek that come from JUCO? We know Nebraska's staff loves the JUCO ranks. They just picked up a commitment yesterday. But there's opportunity for some of these guys to come back next year.
I think this is the power of it's a great question you bring up there, Nick, because you mentioned the junior college commit they just got. Okay, local guy. And there's some of his teammates that Nebraska's already had commitments from. He comes out to a weekend that you could not have painted a better picture. He's in attendance on Saturday's game in that walk-off home run. He gets to see Husker Nation at a fever pitch. And one of the more cooler memories, at least this year and in a couple of years, anytime you went on a walk-off home run like that against a team like Michigan. And so I think you're captured in the moment and you're like, yeah, this is where I want to play baseball. But you bring that up of new guys that are looking to make Nebraska their new home. How about guys that are thinking about sticking around and saying, gosh, am I really done with this? And I love Joshua Overbeek is one of those guys. I made mention this in the broadcast on Sunday. I said, boy, would you really love to see him come back another year, because he has played as solid at third base as you could ask for. Now the offense has come around as well. I think you're scratching the surface right now with Overbeek. If he could give you that consistency, even in one more year, what he might be able to do going forward. Now, I'm not saying he's going to be a top 5 or 10 round draft pick, but a guy that maybe has some potential to play some type of pro ball somewhere, given his size and the type of work that he puts in. So I think these last couple of weeks are important from that standpoint. Find yourself in a Big Ten tournament. If you can put on some type of a run and you continue to get more bodies showing up and basking and all of that, it's a tough thing to turn down, a tough thing to walk away from if you are on that roster and you have a decision to be made. I think for Nebraska, I think guys like Joshua Overbeek, I think you'd love to have back. And I think these next couple of weeks are very important when it comes to those decisions.
Hey, Nick, this is Chris Ralph, and I just had a quick question. We were talking about this yesterday. When manager Tracy Smith gets ejected from the game, do you do play-by-play following him all the way out through the berms, or how does that work?
You know what? I wish I did. Because what had happened, and I was solo on Tuesday or on Saturday and Sunday. I wish I had, because it was after the Haligzo home run, and from the angle that we have up in the broadcast booth, and you guys have been up there, so you know that it's the first base coaches or the first base dugout probably has a better angle than what we're seeing up there. I thought it was a fair ball, and I didn't think there was really much debate about it. Tracy Smith was convinced. Now, I also do wonder if Tracy Smith was a little bothered by some of the inconsistencies in the strike zone, so he used that as the overall boiling point. But as I realized when he came out, there was a little bit of it. I think I described it, the finger pointing and the contact. But, yeah, I should have went into boxing mode, because it did start to get a little confrontational, where we should have said, and gone, it's Tracy Smith, it's Tracy Smith, he's on it. But then I'd have to calm down, because, it takes forever to walk down that damn warning track to get out of there. So then I just would have been sitting there doing nothing. So, yeah, I mean, if I could go back on it, I probably would have been a little bit more animated. So it's a fair question there.
Nick, he started John with the bullpen.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It was incredible.
Tracy Smith has got a little bit of that in him. He's, wherever he's been, whether it was back at Indiana and had those teams and ASU and now back at Michigan, Good coach, well-respected coach, but a coach comes with a reputation that, he'll ruffle some feathers if he gets the opportunity to do so.
Well, Nick, we'll go ahead and let you go with that. We could go for on and on, and hope maybe we'll have you back on in the near future ahead of the Big Ten tournament, potentially, if Nebraska takes care of business this weekend against the Purdue Boilermakers. Safe travels out to West Lafayette, my friend, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, guys. Anytime. Appreciate it.